Sometimes it takes losing everything to discover what truly matters. Eleanor Whitmore thought her wealth could buy respect, comfort, and control, until a winter night in the mountains taught her otherwise. The widow arrived in Red Bluff to meet Jonah Reed, a mountain man selling her timberland. Over supper in his simple cabin, she mocked his rough-hewn logs and tin dishes. "You live like this by choice?" she laughed. Jonah just smiled. That night, a blizzard trapped her. When the storm destroyed the barn, Jonah risked his life in the freezing cold to save her horse. By morning, with snow covering the world and firelight warming the cabin, Eleanor understood something profound. This humble place held more warmth than her mansion ever did. Could a woman who seemed to have everything learn she'd been living with nothing? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor Whitmore had worn black for 6 months, though not from grief. The morning dress was expected proper, a uniform that allowed her to move through Boston society without unwanted questions. Charles had been 63 when his heart gave out during a business dinner, slumping forward into his roast beef while discussing railroad investments. She'd been 38, sitting across from him, watching it happen, with a strange sense of detachment. They'd called her brave at the funeral, composed, a woman of remarkable strength. What they didn't know was that she'd felt nothing at all. Their marriage had been a transaction from the start. Charles Whitmore needed a presentable wife to soften his reputation as a ruthless industrialist. Eleanor Bradford needed security after her father's textile business collapsed, leaving her family with debts and whispers. At 22, she'd accepted his proposal with clear eyes and no illusions. He'd given her a mansion on Beacon Hill, accounts at the finest shops, servants' carriages, and a position in society. In return, she'd hosted his dinners, smiled at his associates, and asked nothing about where he spent his evenings. It was a lonely life, but she'd convinced herself it was enough. After all, love was for novels and naive girls. Eleanor had learned early that security mattered more than sentiment. The morning after Charles's funeral, his business partners had arrived at her door. 3 men in expensive suits offering condolences that felt rehearsed. They'd sat in Charles's study, surrounded by his leather-bound books and mahogany furniture, and explained her situation with the kind of patience one uses with children. Charles had been overextended. Certain investments hadn't performed as expected. There were obligations, outstanding loans, partnerships that needed to be honored. They assured her the mansion was safe, her accounts secure, but suggested strongly that she consider selling her shares in the company. For her own peace of mind, they said. To simplify matters, Eleanor had smiled and thanked them and shown them to the door. Then she'd locked herself in Charles's study and spent 3 days reading through every document she could find. What she discovered left her cold. Charles had mortgaged the house twice. The accounts were thin. His partners had been systematically positioning themselves to absorb his assets the moment he died, and they clearly expected his widow to cooperate meekly. She refused to be meek. Her lawyer, Edward Morrison, was an old family friend who'd known her father. When she summoned him, he arrived with sympathy and surprising advice. There was one asset Charles's partners didn't fully control, a land investment out west, timberland in the Montana Territory, purchased years ago on speculation. The deed was solely in Charles's name, which meant it now belonged to Eleanor. Morrison suggested she could sell it privately, use the proceeds to establish independence, perhaps even invest in something that could generate income. The idea had appealed to her immediately, not for the money alone, but for what it represented: escape. A chance to slip free of Charles's shadow, of Boston's suffocating propriety, of the life she'd endured for 16 years. The West was raw, uncivilized, full of rough men and rougher conditions. But it was also far from the people who thought they could manage her future. Morrison had made the arrangements. The land bordered property owned by a recluse named Jonah Reed, who'd expressed interest in purchasing it. Reed was willing to pay fair market value and had a reputation for honest dealing. Morrison had corresponded with Reed's representative and arranged for Eleanor to travel west, meet Reed, inspect the property, and finalize the sale. It would take 2 months, perhaps 3. By the time she returned, she'd have capital and options. Eleanor had boarded the train in late October, carrying 2 trunks and a leather-bound ledger that contained every financial detail of Charles's business affairs. She'd studied those numbers during the long journey, memorizing debts and assets, preparing for the inevitable confrontations with his partners. The train had carried her through landscapes that changed daily, the neat farms of the East giving way to rolling plains, then to territories where civilization seemed to thin with every mile. Red Bluff was hardly a town by Boston standards. A main street of packed dirt, wooden buildings that looked temporary, and a population that seemed to consist mainly of miners, ranchers, and men who'd come west to forget something. The train depot was a simple platform. The hotel was called Harper's Inn, run by a weathered woman named Sarah Harper, who looked Eleanor up and down with frank assessment before showing her to a clean but sparse room. Eleanor had arrived on a Thursday afternoon. The meeting with Jonah Reed was scheduled for Saturday, giving her 2 days to acclimate. She'd spent that time observing the town, taking careful walks along the wooden sidewalks, noting the way people moved and spoke. Life here was different, direct. People looked you in the eye. Women wore practical dresses and worked alongside men. There was a roughness to it all, but also an honesty that felt foreign after Boston's elaborate social codes. Mrs. Harper had been blunt when Eleanor asked about Jonah Reed. Mountain man. Keeps to himself up near Timber Ridge. Lost his family years back and hasn't been the same since. Good man, though. Honest, works hard. Doesn't suffer fools. She'd paused, measuring Eleanor with sharp eyes. You planning to buy his land? Perhaps, Eleanor had replied carefully. Then you treat him fair. Reed doesn't need charity, but he deserves respect. Don't go up there with city airs and expect him to bow. The warning had irritated Eleanor at the time. She'd been managing difficult men and complex social situations for 16 years. A frontier recluse hardly seemed like a challenge. Morrison had hired a local man named Tom Brennan to drive her up the mountain. Tom was in his 50s, taciturn but competent, with a wagon that looked sturdy enough for rough terrain. He'd loaded her small traveling bag Saturday morning and helped her onto the bench, seat without comment, on her fine wool traveling. Dress or leather gloves. The road, if it could be called that, wound up through pine forests that grew denser as they climbed. The air changed, becoming sharper, cleaner, scented with resin and earth. Eleanor found herself gripping the wagon seat as they navigated switchbacks and rocky passages. Below them, the valley spread out in shades of gold and brown. The town of Red Bluff shrinking to toy-sized buildings. How much farther? She'd asked after an hour. Another hour, maybe 2, Tom had replied. Reed's place is remote. He likes it that way. Why would anyone choose to live so isolated? Tom had glanced at her. Maybe he's got his reasons. Not everyone finds peace in crowds, Mom. The comment had struck her oddly. She'd lived surrounded by people her entire adult life, and had never felt anything but alone. But she'd said nothing, letting the silence settle as the wagon climbed higher into the wilderness. When they'd finally reached Jonah Reed's property, Eleanor's first thought had been one of disappointment. The cabin was small, constructed of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss. A stone chimney rose from one end, trailing wood smoke. The windows were few and small, covered with oiled paper rather than glass. Nearby stood a barn that looked more weathered than the cabin, and beyond that, towering pines stretched up the mountainside as far as she could see. This was what she'd traveled 2,000 miles to see. This was the man who would buy her timber and help fund her independence. Tom had helped her down from the wagon, and Eleanor had smoothed her skirts, straightened her shoulders, and prepared to meet Jonah Reed. The cabin door had opened before she could knock, and a man stepped out into the afternoon light. He was tall, perhaps 40, with dark hair that touched his collar, and a beard that was neatly trimmed despite his isolation. His clothes were simple, Wool shirt, worn trousers, boots that had seen hard use. But what struck Eleanor most were his eyes. They were clear, direct, and seemed to take in everything about her in a single glance. There was no deference in that gaze, no acknowledgement of her status or refinement. He looked at her the way one might examine a tree before deciding whether to cut it, assessing, measuring, coming to conclusions. "Mrs. Whitmore," he'd said, his voice low and steady. "Welcome to Timber Ridge." Eleanor extended her gloved hand, expecting Jonah to shake it with the awkward deference most frontier men showed when meeting Eastern ladies. Instead, he took it briefly, his grip firm but not lingering, and released it without ceremony. "Mr. Reed, thank you for agreeing to meet with me." "Seemed practical," he replied. "Your lawyer said you wanted to see the land before finalizing terms. Makes sense to know what you're buying." Tom had already begun unhitching the horses, clearly planning to wait while Eleanor conducted her business. Jonah glanced at the sky, where clouds were gathering in grey masses above the peaks. "Storm's coming," he said. "We should look at the property now, while there's light. Can discuss terms over supper after." Eleanor nodded, though the idea of sharing a meal in that rustic cabin made her uncomfortable. Still, she hadn't travelled all this way to be squeamish about frontier hospitality. Jonah led her along a narrow trail that wound through the pines. He moved with easy confidence, barely seeming to notice the uneven ground that Eleanor had to watch carefully in her impractical city boots. The forest around them was quiet, except for the whisper of wind through the branches and the occasional call of a bird she couldn't identify. "The property line runs along that ridge," Jonah said, pointing to a rocky outcrop visible through the trees. "Follows the creek down through the valley, then back up the eastern slope. About 300 acres of prime timber. Ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, some spruce higher up." Eleanor tried to assess the trees with a buyer's eye, though she knew next to nothing about lumber. They seemed tall and straight, which presumably meant they were valuable. But it was the sheer scale of the forest that impressed her, the way it stretched endlessly in every direction, untouched and ancient. "You've harvested from this land?" she asked selectively. "Take what I need for building or firewood, let the rest grow. Forest has been here longer than any of us will be. Seems right to leave most of it standing." The comment surprised her. Charles and his associates had viewed resources as things to be extracted and converted to profit as efficiently as possible. The idea of restraint, of leaving value unharvested simply because it seemed right, was foreign to everything she'd learned about business. They walked for nearly an hour, Jonah pointing out boundaries and features, while Eleanor tried to commit details to memory. By the time they returned to the cabin, the wind had picked up noticeably, and the temperature had dropped. Tom was seeing to the horses, his weathered face turned toward the darkening sky with obvious concern. "Should head back soon," he said to Eleanor. "Don't like the look of those clouds." "We haven't concluded our business," Eleanor replied, surprised by his urgency. "Business can wait, Mom. Weather up here doesn't." But Jonah was already opening the cabin door. "Come inside first, get warm, have something to eat. We can discuss the sale, then you can decide about the weather." Eleanor accepted, grateful for the warmth if nothing else. The cabin's interior was as simple as she'd expected. A single large room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table and chairs, shelves lined with supplies and a few books, and a bed frame with what looked like a straw mattress in one corner. But it was scrupulously clean, and a fire already burned in the hearth, filling the space with welcome heat. Jonah hung his coat on a peg and moved to the fire, where a pot of something was simmering. Eleanor stood uncertainly, still in her travelling cloak, unsure of the protocol. This wasn't a Boston parlour where servants would take her wrap and offer tea. This was a frontier cabin where a man clearly lived alone and managed for himself. "You can sit," Jonah said, nodding toward the table. "Stew's been cooking most of the day. Should be ready." Eleanor removed her cloak and gloves, laying them carefully over the back of a chair before sitting. The chair was sturdy but unadorned, the table scarred from use. On the shelves she noticed the books, not many, perhaps a dozen, but well worn. Homer, Shakespeare, a Bible, some volumes she couldn't identify from this distance. "Unexpected," In a mountain man's cabin, Jonah ladled stew into wooden bowls, venison from the smell with root vegetables and herbs. He set one before her along with a spoon and a piece of cornbread, then filled a second bowl for himself. Tom joined them, accepting his portion with a nod of thanks. The stew was simple but good, seasoned with care. Eleanor ate slowly, aware of how different this meal was from the elaborate dinners she'd hosted in Boston. No china, no silver, no servants hovering to refill wine glasses. Just 3 people sharing food around a rough table, while wind began to moan outside. "The land," Jonah said, breaking the silence. "Your lawyer offered fair market value." "I'm willing to accept those terms if you're satisfied with what you've seen." Eleanor set down her spoon. "It's good timber. I can see that, even with my limited knowledge. But I'll be honest, Mr. Reed, I'm curious why you're selling. This is clearly land you value." Jonah was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on his bowl. "Winter's been hard. Lost some stock. Repairs needed on the barn. And I'm getting older. Maintaining this much property alone gets harder every year. Selling part of it makes sense. Lets me keep what I need and provides capital for what comes next." There was something in his voice, a weariness or perhaps resignation, that made Eleanor wonder if he was telling the complete truth. But she had her own secrets, her own reasons for being here, so she didn't press. "Then we have an agreement," she said. "I'll have the papers drawn up when I return to town. Payment can be transferred through my lawyer." "Agreed." Tom stood abruptly, moving to the window. "Mrs. Whitmore, we need to leave, now. That storm's moving faster than I thought." Eleanor rose and joined him at the window. What she saw made her stomach tighten. The sky had turned the color of old lead, and snow was already beginning to fall, not gentle flakes, but a driving wall of white that obscured the forest beyond the clearing. "We can make it if we hurry," Tom said, already reaching for his coat, but Jonah was shaking his head. "You won't make it half a mile in that. Mountain storms come fast and hard. You'd be caught on the road with no shelter." "I know these mountains," Tom argued. "So do I, and I'm telling you that storm will be a blizzard within the hour. You leave now, you'll freeze before you reach the valley." Eleanor looked between the 2 men, feeling control of the situation slipping away. She couldn't stay here. It was improper, impossible. She was a respectable widow, and Jonah Reed was a stranger, and spending the night in his cabin would be... Thunder cracked overhead impossibly loud, followed by a gust of wind that made the cabin walls creak. Snow was falling heavily now, accumulating with frightening speed. Tom swore under his breath. "She's right to be concerned, Reed. It's not proper. Proper doesn't matter when you're dead," Jonah said flatly. He turned to Eleanor. "Mom, I understand your concern, but staying alive matters more than propriety. Storm will pass by morning. You can leave then." Eleanor wanted to argue, to insist on some alternative, but the wind's howl and the snow's fury made the danger obvious. Tom looked torn between duty and survival. "I'll sleep in the barn with the horses," Tom offered. "Barn's not insulated," Jonah said. "You'd freeze." "There's room here. I'll give Mrs. Whitmore the bed. You and I can sleep by the fire." It wasn't ideal, but Eleanor could see no better option. She nodded stiffly. "Very well. Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Reed," Tom reluctantly agreed. And Jonah began making preparations for the long night ahead, bringing in extra firewood, checking that the windows were secure, laying out blankets near the hearth. Eleanor stood by the fire, watching the snow accumulate outside with growing unease. She'd come to this mountain to conduct simple business. Now she was trapped in a cabin with 2 strange men, dependent on their protection. Her carefully maintained control completely dissolved. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent 16 years in a mansion surrounded by servants and society, yet had never felt as vulnerable as she did right now in this simple cabin on a mountainside. Outside, the storm raged with increasing violence. Inside, Jonah moved about his preparations with calm efficiency, seemingly unbothered by the disruption to his solitary life. Eleanor watched him ladle more stew into a pot for later, watched him arrange blankets with care, watched the firelight play across his weathered features. There was something about his self-sufficiency that both impressed and unsettled her. He didn't need anyone, didn't depend on anyone. He'd built this life alone and seemed content with it. She'd never been content. Not once. The thought came unbidden, surprising in its honesty. Eleanor turned back to the window, watching the world disappear into white, and wondered what the morning would bring. The storm worsened as evening fell. Eleanor sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that Jonah had poured for her. The wind screamed around the cabin's corners, and snow hissed against the windows with the sound of thrown sand. Tom sat near the fire, occasionally glancing toward the door, as if gauging whether conditions had improved enough to make an escape. They hadn't. Jonah moved about the cabin with quiet purpose, checking the fire, adjusting the damper on the stove, ensuring everything was secure. Eleanor found herself studying him in the lamplight, noting details she'd missed during their walk through the forest. His hands were scarred from work, but moved with surprising grace. His face, despite the beard, was more refined than she'd initially thought, strong features that suggested intelligence behind the frontier exterior. "You have books," she said, breaking the silence. It came out more accusatory than she'd intended, as if she'd caught him in some deception. Jonah glanced at the shelf. "I do. Most mountain men don't read Homer. Most Boston ladies don't travel alone to buy timberland." He said it mildly, without heat, but the point landed. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. "Forgive me. That was presumptuous." "It was honest," Jonah replied. He pulled a chair closer to the fire and sat, leaning back with an ease that suggested this was his natural element. "People are surprised. I had an education before the war. Studied literature, actually, at a college back east. Seemed important at the time. What changed?" Eleanor asked, curious despite herself. "The war. 4 years of seeing what men do to each other when they're convinced they're right. I came home different. Couldn't settle back into the life I'd planned. So I came west, found this place, and discovered that books still mattered, but in a different way. They're not about building a career anymore. They're just for themselves." Tom shifted by the fire, clearly uncomfortable with the personal turn of the conversation. "I'll check on the horses," he muttered, standing. "Tom, the barn—" Eleanor started. "Just a quick check, ma'am. I'll be right back." He pulled on his coat and pushed out into the storm, closing the door quickly behind him. Eleanor and Jonah were left alone in the firelight, the cabin suddenly feeling much smaller. "He's uncomfortable," Jonah observed. "He's concerned about propriety." "About my reputation, and you're not?" Eleanor considered the question. "I should be. I've spent my entire adult life being proper, doing what was expected, playing the role I was assigned." She paused, surprised by her own candor. "But sitting here now, trapped by a storm in a mountain cabin, I find I don't care as much as I should." Jonah studied her for a long moment. "What role were you assigned?" "The dutiful wife. The gracious hostess. The ornamental woman who made her husband look good and never asked difficult questions." "Sounds lonely." The word struck her with unexpected force. Lonely. Yes, that was exactly what it had been. 16 years of loneliness dressed up in silk and propriety. "It was practical," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "So is this cabin. Doesn't mean it's not lonely sometimes." Before Eleanor could respond, the door burst open and Tom stumbled back inside, covered in snow and breathing hard. "The barn," he said urgently. "The roof's giving way. Too much snow and the supports are old. Your horse is in there, ma'am. If it collapses—" Eleanor stood quickly, her heart lurching. The horse was a beautiful mare she'd purchased in Red Bluff. A significant investment, and more than that, an animal she'd grown fond of during their brief acquaintance. Jonah was already moving, pulling on his heavy coat and grabbing a coil of rope from a peg. "How bad?" "Bad. The center beam is cracking. Could go any minute. I'll get the horse out." Jonah wrapped a scarf around his face and headed for the door. Eleanor grabbed his arm. "It's too dangerous. You can barely see 3 feet in that storm." He looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then met her eyes. There was something in his gaze, calm, determined, but also kind. "It's a life, Mrs. Whitmore. Can't just let it die when I can do something about it." "It's just a horse," she said. though she didn't believe it. No such thing as just when it comes to a life. Horse didn't ask to be stuck in a failing barn, deserves better than dying afraid in the dark. He pulled free gently and stepped out into the storm with Tom following. The door closed, and Eleanor was left alone in the cabin, her heart pounding with an anxiety she didn't entirely understand. It wasn't just concern for the horse. It was something about Jonah's calm certainty, his willingness to risk himself for a creature that most men in her world would have written off as an acceptable loss. She moved to the window, pressing her face against the cold glass, but could see nothing beyond the swirling white. Minutes passed, 5, 10, 15. Each one felt longer than the last. Eleanor paced, unused to this helpless feeling. In Boston, problems were solved with money and instructions to servants. Here there was only the storm and the waiting. What if the roof collapsed while they were inside? What if they got lost in the blizzard trying to return? She pictured Jonah lying frozen in the snow, and the image disturbed her more than it should have. Finally, through the white chaos, she saw movement. Two figures emerged, one leading the horse, the other supporting him. Eleanor rushed to the door and threw it open, letting in a blast of Arctic air. Tom came first, then Jonah with the mare on a lead rope, both of them covered in snow and ice. They got the horse into the cabin's small attached shelter, barely more than a lean-to, but warmer than the failing barn. Jonah stumbled back into the main room, and Eleanor saw immediately that he was in trouble. His face was pale beneath the coating of ice, his movements uncoordinated. Tom wasn't much better, but Jonah had clearly taken the worst of it. "Sit down," Eleanor commanded, surprising herself with the authority in her voice. "Both of you by the fire, now." She helped Jonah to a chair near the hearth, her hands working to remove his frozen coat. The fabric was stiff with ice, and Jonah's fingers were too numb to manage the buttons. Eleanor worked them free, her own fingers trembling slightly, and pulled the coat away. His shirt beneath was damp with melted snow. "This needs to come off too," she said. Jonah looked at her through eyes that seemed slightly unfocused. "Not proper, ma'am. I don't care about proper right now. You're half frozen, and I won't have you dying of cold because of propriety." She turned to Tom. "Get him out of that shirt and into dry clothes. I'll make hot coffee." Tom nodded, and Eleanor moved to the stove, her hands shaking as she prepared coffee with whiskey in it. She'd seen Jonah's bottle on the shelf and didn't ask permission. Behind her, she heard the rustle of fabric as Tom helped Jonah change. She kept her back turned, staring at the stove, but she was acutely aware of every sound. When she finally turned back, Jonah was wrapped in a heavy blanket, sitting close to the fire. His hair was damp, his face gradually regaining color. Tom had changed as well, and was rubbing his hands together near the flames. Eleanor brought them both coffee laced with whiskey. Jonah took the cup with hands that still trembled slightly, and drank deeply. The tension in the room had shifted. Something had changed in those terrifying minutes of waiting, though Eleanor couldn't quite name what. "Thank you," she said quietly. Jonah looked up at her, his eyes clearer now. "For what?" "For saving my horse. For risking yourself. Life is life," he said simply. "Worth protecting." The words settled into Eleanor like stones dropping into still water. In her world, worth was measured in dollars and social position. Here, apparently, it was measured differently. She sat down across from him, still holding her own cup of coffee, and for the first time in 16 years, felt like she was seeing clearly. Tom eventually excused himself to check on the horse in the lean-to, leaving Eleanor and Jonah alone again. The storm continued its assault on the cabin, but inside, the fire crackled warmth, and the whiskey-laced coffee had restored feeling to frozen limbs. Eleanor found herself studying Jonah in the firelight, seeing him differently now. Not as the rough mountain man she'd expected, but as someone more complex, someone who'd chosen this life deliberately, with full knowledge of what he was leaving behind. "You said you lost your family," Eleanor said quietly. The words came out before she could reconsider their propriety, but something about the night, the storm, the danger they'd faced, the intimacy of the small cabin made normal social boundaries feel irrelevant. Jonah was quiet for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he set down his cup and leaned back, his eyes distant. Sarah and Emma, my wife and daughter. Emma was 6 years old. His voice was steady, but Eleanor heard the old pain beneath it. Fever swept through our town. Spring of '68. Half the population got sick. Most recovered. Some didn't. I'm sorry, Eleanor said, and meant it. Sarah fought hard, tried to keep Emma comfortable while battling the fever herself. In the end, I lost them both within 2 days of each other. I buried them in the town cemetery, sold everything we owned, and came west. Couldn't stay in that house in that town, surrounded by memories of what I'd lost. Eleanor set down her own cup, her hand suddenly needing something to do. She understood loss, though not like that. She'd lost years to a loveless marriage, lost herself to propriety and expectation. But she'd never lost someone she truly loved, because she'd never truly loved anyone. How do you bear it? She asked. Jonah looked at her directly. You don't bear it. You carry it. It's always there, part of you, but you find ways to live alongside it. Work helps. The mountains help. Solitude helps, mostly, but you're lonely. Lonely's different from alone. I'm alone by choice. Lonely is just what it is. Eleanor understood that distinction perhaps better than he knew. She'd been surrounded by people her entire adult life and had felt more alone than she imagined possible. May I see them? She asked, gesturing toward the small shelf where she'd noticed a tintype photograph earlier. Jonah hesitated, then rose and brought the photograph to her. In the firelight, Eleanor studied the image. A younger Jonah, clean-shaven and dressed in a suit, standing beside a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. In front of them, a little girl with dark curls grinned at the camera with unself-conscious joy. They were beautiful, Eleanor said softly. They were everything. Jonah took the photograph back, looking at it for a long moment before returning it to its place. Sarah was the daughter of the town minister. We grew up together, got married young. Everyone said we were foolish, too young to know what we wanted, but we knew. 15 years we had together. They were the best years of my life. Eleanor felt something twist inside her chest. 15 years. She'd had 16 with Charles, and not one of them had been what Jonah described. Not one day of genuine partnership, of real connection. She'd had security, comfort, status, everything except what mattered. You were lucky, she said, to have that. Even for a short time. Jonah looked at her curiously. Your husband, you didn't love him. It wasn't a question. Eleanor considered denying it, but what would be the point? No, I married him for security. He married me for appearance. We both knew the terms. It was a transaction, not a love match. 16 years is a long time to live like that. I convinced myself it was enough. That love was impractical, something for novels. I had a beautiful home, fine things, a position in society. That should have been sufficient, but it wasn't. No, Eleanor admitted. It wasn't, Tom returned, stamping snow from his boots. Horses settling. Storm's not letting up, though. We're here till morning at least. Jonah nodded and stood, gathering blankets from a trunk in the corner. He arranged them near the fire, creating makeshift beds for himself and Tom. For Eleanor, he gestured toward his bed in the corner. It's not much, but the mattress is clean. You'll be warm enough with these quilts. Eleanor started to protest. She couldn't take his bed, but Jonah's expression made it clear the argument was settled. Thank you, she said instead. The three of them prepared for sleep with the awkwardness of strangers forced into unwanted intimacy. Eleanor retired behind a blanket Jonah hung for privacy, changing into her nightdress with trembling fingers. The cabin was warm enough, but she felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't since childhood. When she emerged and moved toward the bed, Jonah and Tom were already settling by the fire, their backs turned to give her privacy. She climbed beneath the quilts, which smelled of pine and wood smoke, and stared at the ceiling beams above her. The storm continued its rage outside, but inside, the only sounds were the fire's crackle and the quiet breathing of two men who'd become her unexpected protectors. Eleanor lay in Jonah Reed's bed in his cabin, wearing her silk nightdress that cost more than his entire wardrobe and felt more at home than she had in her Beacon Hill mansion. It made no sense. This was rough, simple, nothing like the luxury she'd known. But there was something here, an authenticity, a realness, that all her fine possessions had never provided. She thought of Jonah risking himself in the blizzard to save her horse. Life is life, worth protecting. Such a simple philosophy, yet so foreign to the world she'd come from, where everything had a price and nothing had inherent value beyond what it could buy. Eleanor pulled the quilts closer, listening to the storm, and wondered what morning would bring. The land deal felt suddenly less important than understanding why this cabin, this man, this night of forced simplicity, had cracked something open inside her that 16 years of privilege had kept sealed shut. Outside, the wind howled like something alive. Inside, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Eleanor felt something that might have been peace. Eleanor woke to pale light filtering through the cabin's small windows and the smell of coffee brewing. For a disoriented moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then awareness returned. The mountain cabin, the storm, the night spent in a stranger's bed while he slept by the fire. She sat up quickly, clutching the quilts, and saw that Jonah was already up, moving quietly near the stove. Tom still slept by the dying fire, wrapped in blankets. Jonah glanced over and nodded a morning greeting, his voice low to avoid waking Tom. "Storm passed about an hour ago. Coffee's ready if you want some." Eleanor rose, acutely aware of her nightdress and loose hair. She grabbed her shawl from where it hung over a chair, fine silk embroidered with flowers, entirely impractical for frontier life, but serving now as a shield for her modesty. Wrapping it around herself, she moved to the window. The world outside had been transformed. Snow lay thick and pristine over everything, softening edges and muffling sound. The pines drooped under their white burden, and the sky above was the clear, hard blue that comes after storms. It was beautiful in a way that made her throat tight. "How deep?" she asked, 3 feet in places. "Drifts higher than that. Roads won't be passable for a few days at least." Eleanor turned to him alarmed. "Days, maybe 2, 3. Depends on the sun and whether another storm follows. Up here, winter comes fast and stays stubborn." He poured coffee into a tin cup and brought it to her. "I know it's not what you planned, but you're safe here. That's what matters." She took the coffee, wrapping both hands around the warm cup. Safe, yes, she was safe. But she was also stranded in a mountain cabin with a man she barely knew, wearing inappropriate clothing, with no chaperone except Tom, who was hardly proper company. If word of this reached Boston, her reputation, already fragile as a widow traveling alone, would be destroyed. Then again, what did reputation matter when she had no intention of returning to that life? The thought surprised her with its clarity. She'd been planning to go back to Boston after selling the timber, use the money to establish independence while remaining in her familiar world. But standing here in the morning light, wearing her silk shawl over her nightdress in a rough cabin, she realized she didn't want to go back. Not to that house, those people, that empty existence. "You're thinking hard," Jonah observed. He'd returned to the stove, where he was slicing bacon onto a griddle, just realizing some things. Storm'll do that. Forces you to stop and see what's actually there, instead of what you've been telling yourself is there. Tom stirred and woke, sitting up with the groaning confusion of a man who'd slept on a hard floor. He looked around, remembered where he was, and his weathered face creased with concern when he saw Eleanor in her nightdress, even with the shawl. "Morning, Ma'am. I should check on the horses. Give you privacy to dress." He grabbed his coat and escaped outside, clearly uncomfortable. Eleanor felt she should care more about his discomfort, about the impropriety of the situation. But Jonah was treating her presence as matter of fact, cooking breakfast with the same calm efficiency he'd shown in rescuing the horse. There was no awkwardness in him, no assumption of anything inappropriate. It was curiously liberating. "I should dress," she said anyway. Jonah nodded and turned his back, focusing on the bacon while Eleanor retreated behind the privacy blanket. She dressed quickly in yesterday's traveling dress, wishing she had something more practical. The dress was fine wool with far too many buttons, designed for servants to fasten. She managed most of them herself. leaving a few undone that she couldn't reach. When she emerged, Jonah had breakfast laid out. Bacon, cornbread from yesterday, and what looked like fried eggs. Simple food, but it smelled wonderful. Tom returned, stamping snow from his boots, and they sat down to eat together. "Roads'll take time to clear," Tom said between bites. "Could try to make it on foot, but that's a hard walk in this much snow. Especially for—" He stopped, glancing at Eleanor's dress and fine boots. "Especially for a woman in impractical city clothes," Eleanor finished for him. "I understand. I'm not equipped for this." "We'll wait," Jonah said decisively. "Another day or two won't hurt. Safer than risking the road." After breakfast, Tom volunteered to check the condition of the barn and see what could be salvaged. Jonah began the work of maintaining the cabin, splitting firewood, tending the fire, melting snow for water. Eleanor watched, feeling useless. In Boston, she'd had servants for everything. Here, her expensive education in music, French, and social graces meant nothing. "Is there something I can do?" she finally asked. "I don't want to be idle." Jonah looked up from the firewood he was stacking. "Can you cook?" "Not really. I supervised cooks, but I never actually—" "Then you can learn. Come here." He led her to the simple stove and showed her how to manage the fire, how to gauge temperature, how to prepare basic meals. His instructions were patient, practical, free of the condescension she might have expected. He treated her ignorance as a simple gap to be filled, not a character flaw. Eleanor found herself oddly engaged by the work. There was something satisfying about learning to do things with her own hands, about understanding the basic mechanics of keeping alive. When she successfully made a pot of coffee, bitter but drinkable, she felt a disproportionate sense of accomplishment. "Not bad," Jonah said, tasting it. "Little strong, but that's not a problem." They worked through the morning, and Eleanor discovered muscles she hadn't known she had. Carrying water, splitting kindling, even just standing for long periods while learning to cook, all of it was physical in a way her Boston life had never been. At midday, Jonah suggested she rest. "You're not used to this kind of work. Don't want you exhausted." Eleanor sat near the fire, and Jonah settled across from her. He pulled a piece of wood and a small knife from his pocket and began to whittle, his hands moving with practiced ease. Wood shavings curled away from the blade, drifting down like the snow outside. "What are you making?" Eleanor asked. "Nothing in particular. Just working with my hands. Helps me think." She watched him work, fascinated by the focused calm of it. "What are you thinking about?" Jonah glanced up, a slight smile touching his mouth. "Wondering what a Boston lady thinks about her first night in a mountain cabin." Eleanor considered her answer carefully. "I think I've been living wrong." The knife paused mid-cut. "How so?" "I've spent 16 years pursuing the wrong things. Security, status, the appearance of success. I convinced myself those things mattered. That comfort was enough. But it wasn't comfort, it was emptiness dressed up to look respectable. And now I'm sitting in a cabin wearing yesterday's dress with undone buttons I can't reach. Drinking coffee I made myself that's too strong. Watching a man whittle wood for no purpose, except that it helps him think. And I feel more—" She paused, searching for the word. "More real than I have in years." Jonah set down his whittling. "Those buttons that need fastening. Do you want help?" It was a practical question, asked matter-of-factly, but something in Eleanor's chest tightened. The intimacy of it, this man she barely knew offering to help with something so personal. In Boston, a servant would have handled it. Here there was only him. "Yes," she said quietly. "Please." She turned her back, lifting her hair out of the way. She felt his fingers at her shoulder blades, felt him carefully work the small buttons through their loops. His touch was gentle, respectful, and Eleanor found herself holding her breath. When he finished, his hands rested briefly on her shoulders. Just a moment, but enough to send awareness through her entire body. "There," he said, stepping back. "Thank you." Eleanor turned to face him, and something passed between them in the firelight, recognition, attraction, possibility. Neither of them spoke it aloud, but it hung in the air like the scent of pine. Outside, Tom's footsteps crunched through snow, heading toward the cabin. The moment broke. But as Eleanor moved to help prepare lunch, she knew something had shifted. The night had been about survival. This day was about something else entirely, about two people discovering connection in an unexpected place, about walls beginning to crack that had stood for years. And Eleanor, for the first time in her adult life, found herself hoping those walls would fall. The second day passed in a rhythm that felt both strange and natural to Eleanor. She woke early, helped prepare breakfast under Jonah's patient instruction, and spent the morning learning the basic skills of frontier living. Tom worked on repairing the barn's damaged roof, grateful for the clear weather. Jonah moved between outdoor chores and teaching Eleanor, treating her presence as if it were the most natural thing in the world. By afternoon, Eleanor had learned to tend the fire properly, prepare simple meals, and even mend a torn shirt, though her stitching was clumsy compared to Jonah's efficient work. Her hands, unused to such labor, were developing small blisters. But she found herself oddly proud of these marks, evidence that she was learning to do real things. While Jonah went to help Tom with the barn, Eleanor explored the cabin more thoroughly. On the shelf beside the books, she found a worn Bible, its leather cover soft with handling. When she opened it, pressed wildflowers fell out. Columbine, lupine, Indian paintbrush, each one carefully preserved between the pages. She was examining them when Jonah returned, stomping snow from his boots. He saw what she held and stopped. Sarah's, he said quietly. She loved wildflowers. Every spring and summer, she'd press them in the Bible to save them. Each one marked something, a special day, a memory. I couldn't bear to remove them after she died. Eleanor touched one of the delicate pressed flowers with careful fingers. She marked your life together, made it tangible. She did. Jonah moved closer, looking down at the flowers with an expression that was both sad and fond. That columbine was from the day Emma was born, the lupine from our 10th anniversary. The paintbrush from the last picnic we had together, just a week before the fever came. You carry her with you everywhere, Eleanor said softly. I do. Some might say that's not healthy, that I should move on. But I don't see it that way. She was part of my life, still is. The love doesn't die just because the person does. Eleanor carefully closed the Bible, replacing the flowers in their marked places. I have nothing like this. No tokens from my marriage, no pressed flowers or special memories. Charles and I shared a house for 16 years, and I couldn't show you a single object that mattered to both of us. That's a different kind of lonely, Jonah observed. It is. Eleanor set the Bible back on the shelf with care. I envy you, even with the grief. You had something real. I had nothing dressed up to look like something. Jonah studied her for a long moment. It's not too late to have real things, Eleanor. It was the first time he'd used her given name. The formality of Mrs. Whitmore had dropped away naturally over the past 2 days, but hearing him say Eleanor felt significant, intimate. She met his eyes and saw understanding there, and something else, warmth, possibility, a question he wasn't quite asking. No, she agreed softly. Perhaps it's not. That evening, after Tom had retired early claiming exhaustion, Eleanor and Jonah sat by the fire together. The storm had left the world outside clean and quiet, and inside the cabin, the only sounds were the crackling flames and the occasional shift of settling logs. Tell me about your life before the war, Eleanor said. You mentioned studying literature. Jonah settled back in his chair, his hands occupied with whittling again. The small wooden bird was taking shape now, wings beginning to emerge from the rough block. I was going to be a teacher. Loved books, loved learning. Thought I'd spend my life in a schoolroom, helping young people discover Homer and Shakespeare. What happened? The war happened. I enlisted because it seemed right, seemed necessary. Spent 4 years learning that there's nothing noble about killing, even when you're convinced you're on the right side. Came home and couldn't imagine standing in front of a classroom, pretending the world was the way books said it should be. So you came here, eventually. Married Sarah first. We'd been engaged before the war. Tried to settle, be normal. But the nightmares kept coming. The memories. Sarah understood. She suggested we move west, start fresh, where I wouldn't be reminded every day of what I'd done and seen. We found this place, built this cabin. Emma was born here. For those years I was almost whole again. Eleanor heard the pain beneath his words, the way grief lived alongside his memories of happiness. When they died, you could have left. Gone somewhere else, started over again. I thought about it. But Sarah loved this place. She's buried in the clearing beyond the ridge, her and Emma together. I couldn't leave them. And besides, he paused, his knife working steadily. This cabin, this mountain, it's the last place I was happy. Leaving would feel like abandoning that. So you stay here alone? I do, or I did. He looked up at her. Loneliness becomes habit after a while. You convince yourself you prefer it, that needing people is weakness, that it's safer to stay separate. Is it safer? Eleanor asked. Safer, yes. Better, no. They fell into comfortable silence, and Eleanor felt the truth of his words settling into her. She'd spent 16 years safe from rejection, safe from vulnerability, safe from the risk of caring too much. And she'd been miserable. Jonah finished the wooden bird and held it up to the firelight, examining his work. It was small, delicate, surprisingly beautiful for something carved with a simple knife. He turned it in his hands, then offered it to Eleanor. For you, he said. Eleanor took it carefully, feeling the smooth wood warm from his touch. It's lovely. But why? Because you're learning to see things differently, learning to value what matters instead of what looks impressive. That takes courage. Like a bird learning to fly. Eleanor held the small carving, feeling tears prick her eyes. No one had ever given her something like this, something made by hand, given without expectation, simply because the giver thought she deserved it. Thank you, she whispered. You're welcome. Outside, an owl called through the cold night. Inside, Eleanor looked at this man who'd lost everything and built a simple life from the ruins, and felt something she'd never felt for Charles despite 16 years of marriage. She felt seen, understood, valued for who she actually was rather than what she represented. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. And somewhere deep inside, Eleanor felt those careful walls she'd built around her heart beginning to crack open. The third morning dawned clear and cold. Tom announced that he thought the main road might be passable by afternoon if they were willing to work for it. The snow had begun melting where the sun hit directly, and with some shoveling, they could likely get the wagon through. Eleanor felt an unexpected pang at the news. She should have been relieved. Propriety restored, reputation salvaged, return to civilization imminent. Instead, she felt something closer to grief. The past 3 days had been strange and uncomfortable, and completely unlike anything she'd ever experienced. They had also been the most honest days of her life, but before they could begin preparations for departure, Tom returned from town with supplies and mail. He'd made an early morning trip down the mountain on foot, checking the road conditions and picking up items from the general store. Among the supplies was a packet of letters that had been forwarded to Eleanor in Red Bluff, held by Mrs. Harper at the inn. Eleanor took them with steady hands, though something in her stomach tightened. The top letter bore her business manager's return address in Boston. She'd been expecting regular correspondence about Charles's affairs, but something about this particular envelope made her uneasy. "I'll see to the horses," Tom said diplomatically, leaving her privacy to read. Jonah glanced at the letters but said nothing, moving to the stove to prepare coffee. Eleanor sat at the table and opened the first envelope with hands that trembled slightly. The letter was dated 3 weeks earlier, time for it to travel west and be forwarded. Her business manager, Howard Preston, wrote in his usual precise hand, but the words made Eleanor's vision blur. "Mrs. Whitmore, I write with urgent news regarding your late husband's financial affairs. A thorough audit of Mr. Whitmore's accounts has revealed significant irregularities that were not apparent at the time of his death. I regret to inform you that Mr. Whitmore's debts are far more extensive than initially believed. Several creditors have come forward with claims against the estate. More troubling, it appears Mr. Whitmore borrowed substantial sums using various properties as collateral, including the Beacon Hill residence. He also appears to have made certain investments that proved disastrous. Losses he concealed through creative accounting practices. The full scope of the situation is still being assessed. But I must be frank, the estate is insolvent. The house will need to be sold to satisfy creditors. Your personal accounts, while in your name, are subject to claims given the intermingling of marital assets. I'm working with legal counsel to protect what we can. But you must prepare for the likelihood that you will retain very little of what you believed to be your inheritance. Additionally, and most pressingly, I've discovered that the Montana timberland you traveled to inspect was used as collateral for a loan Mr. Whitmore took shortly before his death. The creditor is a Boston-based investment firm with interests in Western lumber operations. If the loan is not satisfied within 60 days of notice, the property defaults to the creditor. I am sending separate correspondence to the law office representing Mr. Reed regarding this matter, as it may affect the sale you were negotiating. I strongly advise you to complete whatever business you can and return to Boston immediately. There are legal matters requiring your attention, and I fear your financial situation is more precarious than you realize. Eleanor read the letter twice, the words refusing to make sense. Insolvent, collateral, default, the house gone, the accounts frozen. Everything she'd believed was hers, revealed as illusion built on Charles's hidden debts and failures. She'd known Charles was manipulative. She'd known he viewed her as property. But she'd believed he was at least competent, that the wealth was real even if the marriage wasn't. Now even that was stripped away. Her hands were shaking when she set down the first letter and opened the second. This one was from a law firm she didn't recognize, written in cold legal language that made Preston's letter seem warm by comparison. It detailed the loan, the collateral, the timeline for default. The Montana timberland, her escape route, her financial salvation, was already forfeit unless she could produce over $20,000 within 6 weeks. She didn't have $20,000. She didn't have $2,000. Once Charles' debts were settled, she'd likely have nothing at all. Eleanor sat frozen, the letters spread before her like evidence of her own foolishness. She'd thought herself clever for escaping Boston, for taking control of her financial future. But she'd been playing with money that was never real, making plans with assets that were already claimed. She was not an independent widow making shrewd investments. She was a penniless woman with a tarnished reputation who'd traveled 2,000 miles to complete a land sale that couldn't legally happen. Eleanor? She looked up to find Jonah watching her, concern clear in his expression. Tom had come back inside and stood by the door, reading her distress in her posture. "What's wrong?" Jonah asked quietly. Eleanor tried to speak, but her throat was tight. She pushed the letters across the table toward him, unable to explain. Jonah read them both, his expression growing grave. When he finished, he set them down carefully. "I'm ruined," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything's gone. The house, the money, even this land I came to buy. It was all an illusion. Charles left me nothing but debts and obligations I didn't even know existed." "The land is forfeit?" Tom asked. "Unless I can pay $20,000 within 6 weeks, which I cannot possibly do." Eleanor felt hysterical laughter bubbling up. "I mocked your simple cabin, your humble life. I stood here in my fine dress and expensive boots and pitied you for not having what I had. And the entire time I had nothing. Less than nothing. I'm in debt for amounts I can't even comprehend." Jonah was quiet for a long moment. "What will you do?" "I don't know." Eleanor pressed her hands to her face, feeling the careful control she'd maintained for days finally cracking. "I have to return to Boston. Face the creditors, the lawyers, the people who'll enjoy watching me fall. I'll have to sell everything, beg for mercy, hope they leave me enough to survive on. And after that," her voice broke, "I don't know what comes after that." "You could stay here," Jonah said quietly. Eleanor lowered her hands and stared at him. "What? Stay here? Don't go back to Boston. There's nothing for you there except humiliation and poverty. There's nothing for me here either. I have no money, no prospects, no—" She gestured helplessly. "I'm not suited for frontier life. I can barely cook. I don't know how to survive without servants and accounts and all the things I've depended on my entire life. You learned to cook in 3 days. You can learn the rest. Jonah leaned forward, his expression earnest. Eleanor, you said yourself that you've been living wrong, that you've spent 16 years pursuing empty things. Do you want to go back to that world? Even if you could rebuild what you had, would you want to? The question hit her like a physical blow. Would she want to return to Boston society, to the endless performances and shallow relationships and constant awareness of social standing? Would she want to rebuild a life like the one she'd had with Charles, comfortable and empty and slowly suffocating? No, she whispered. But wanting something different and being able to survive something different are not the same thing. You're stronger than you think, Jonah said. I've watched you these past 3 days. You don't give up. You don't complain. You learn. Those are the qualities that matter here, not whether you can host a dinner party or speak French. Tom cleared his throat. He's right, ma'am. Frontier life is hard, but it's honest. People don't care much about where you came from or what you lost. They care about whether you'll work hard and deal straight. You could make a life here if you wanted to. Eleanor looked between them, seeing kindness in both faces, but also the reality they weren't acknowledging. I can't just stay in Jonah's cabin indefinitely. It's impossible. People would talk. My reputation... Your reputation in Boston is already destroyed, Jonah said bluntly. The moment those debts become public, society will turn on you. You'll be the foolish widow who didn't know her husband was bankrupt. They'll pity you at best, mock you at worst. Is that worth protecting? He was right, and Eleanor knew it. But the alternative he was suggesting felt equally impossible. Stay here, in this rough territory, in this simple cabin, dependent on a man she'd known for 3 days? And yet those 3 days had contained more genuine feeling, more real connection than 16 years of marriage. She'd learned more about herself in Jonah's cabin than in her Beacon Hill mansion. The life she was losing in Boston was one she'd already mourned as empty. Why return to rebuild what had never been worth having? I need to think, she said finally. This is too much to decide right now. Take your time, Jonah said. The road will be passable by tomorrow. You don't have to decide immediately, but Eleanor knew that time was the one thing she didn't have. The 6-week deadline for the loan. The creditors circling in Boston, the reality of her situation, pressing in from all sides. She'd thought coming west was taking control of her life. Instead, she'd discovered she'd never had control at all. She stood abruptly, needing air despite the cold. I'm going for a walk. Eleanor, Jonah started. I just need a moment, please. She grabbed her cloak and stepped outside into the blinding whiteness of the snow-covered world. The cold hit her like a slap, but she welcomed it, needing something sharp and real to cut through the numbness spreading through her chest. She'd traveled 2,000 miles to escape one trap, only to discover she'd been caught in another all along. The question now was whether she had the courage to choose a completely different path, one with no guarantees, no safety net, nothing but the uncertain possibility of something real. Eleanor walked until her feet were numb and her lungs ached from the cold air. The snow crunched under her impractical boots, and the world around her was so white and pure it hurt to look at. She found herself at the clearing Jonah had mentioned, the place where Sarah and Emma were buried. 2 simple wooden crosses marked the graves, and even now, covered in snow, there was something peaceful about the spot. Sarah had chosen well. Eleanor stood there for a long time, thinking about Sarah, a woman who'd loved deeply, who'd pressed wildflowers to mark her happiness, who'd built a real life with a man she'd grown up alongside. What would Sarah think of Eleanor now, this hollow Boston widow, considering staying in the cabin where Sarah had been happy, in the life Sarah had built and left behind? The thought was presumptuous, she knew, but standing in this clearing, Eleanor couldn't help but wonder if Sarah would understand what it meant to discover too late that you'd been living the wrong life entirely. When Eleanor finally returned to the cabin, her face was red with cold and her hands were shaking. Jonah looked up from the fire where he'd been cooking lunch, his expression carefully neutral. I'm sorry, Eleanor said. I shouldn't have walked off like that. You needed to think. Nothing wrong with that. He handed her coffee, and she wrapped her frozen hands around the warm cup gratefully. They ate lunch in near silence, Tom casting worried glances at both of them, but wisely saying nothing. After the meal, Tom announced he was going to work on clearing more of the road, giving them privacy again. Jonah and Eleanor sat by the fire, the weight of the morning's revelations hanging between them. Finally, Eleanor spoke. Tell me honestly, if I stayed, what would that look like? I can't impose on your hospitality indefinitely. I have no money to contribute. I'm barely competent at basic survival tasks. What exactly would I be doing here? Jonah set down his coffee and looked at her directly. You'd be learning, working, building something. I mentioned I need to sell the timberland because finances are tight. That's true, but it's not the whole truth. I'm selling because I'm tired of managing this much land alone. It's too much for one person, but if the land defaults to the creditors, not all of it, just the parcel you were planning to buy, the 300 acres we walked through. I've another 200 acres that were never mortgaged. That land is mine, free and clear. It's enough to work with, enough to build something sustainable. Eleanor tried to understand what he was suggesting. You want me to help you work the land? I'm proposing a partnership. You need a place to stay, a way to support yourself. I need help managing this property. We could work together. Harvest timber sustainably, sell to mills in Red Bluff, build a legitimate business. It wouldn't make us wealthy, but it would provide income, enough to live on. A business partnership. Eleanor tested the words. That's extraordinarily generous, but I bring nothing to such a partnership. No capital, no skills, no knowledge of timber or business. You bring intelligence, willingness to learn, education that I don't have. You can manage accounts, write contracts, handle the business side, while I manage the physical work. And you've proven these past 3 days that you're not afraid of hard work. Eleanor felt something tighten in her chest. He was offering her a lifeline, a way forward when she'd thought there was none. But there was something else in his offer, something unspoken that made her both hopeful and terrified. People would talk, she said quietly. A widow living on a mountain with an unmarried man. It would be a scandal, Jonah finished. Yes, it would be. Unless, he paused, seeming to gather his courage. Unless we made it legitimate. Unless we married. The word hung in the air between them. Eleanor's heart pounded. You're proposing marriage. I'm proposing a solution, Jonah said carefully. A practical arrangement that would give you legal protection, social respectability, and a genuine partnership in the business. I'm not asking for... He hesitated. I'm not expecting it to be like what I had with Sarah. That was love. This would be something different. A meeting of needs, mutual benefit, but it would be real in its way, honest, based on genuine respect and partnership. Eleanor's mind raced. He was proposing exactly what she'd had with Charles, a marriage of convenience, a transaction. But even as she thought it, she knew it wasn't the same. Charles had married her to display wealth and status. Jonah was offering her partnership and dignity when she had neither. Charles had given her luxury while expecting nothing from her but decorative silence. Jonah was offering her meaningful work and treating her as an equal, and there was attraction between them. She'd felt it in the way his hands had fastened her buttons, in the gift of the carved bird, in the long conversations by firelight. It wasn't the grand passion of novels, but it was real, more real than anything she'd felt for Charles. That's too generous, Eleanor said finally. You'd be taking on my debts, my reputation, my complete lack of practical skills. What do you gain from such an arrangement? Jonah smiled slightly. Company, purpose, someone to share the work and the evenings. Eleanor, I've been alone for 7 years. I chose that at first because I needed solitude to grieve. But lately, before you arrived, I'd been thinking it was time to rejoin the world in some way. Your situation is desperate, yes, but mine is lonely. Maybe we can address both problems together. You barely know me. I know you're honest. You don't hide behind false politeness. You're willing to admit when you're wrong. You work hard even when it's uncomfortable. You're kind, you worried about me when I went into the storm, and you were grateful I saved your horse even though it put me at risk. Those are the things that matter in a partner. Eleanor stood and moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered world. In Boston, there were lawyers drawing up documents to seize her house, creditors preparing to claim what little she had left, society ladies gossiping about Charles's debts and Eleanor's foolishness. In 6 weeks, the land she'd traveled so far to purchase would default to a lumber company that would clear-cut the forest Jonah loved. Here, there was snow and pine trees and a simple cabin, and a man offering her partnership in building something real. "I'm 38 years old," Eleanor said without turning around. "I've been married once and failed at it. I don't know how to be a frontier wife. I'll make mistakes. I'll be incompetent. There will be moments when you regret this offer." "Probably," Jonah agreed. "And there will be moments when you regret accepting it. But we'll figure it out together. That's what partners do." Eleanor turned to face him. "You said this wouldn't be like what you had with Sarah. That was love, and this would be something different. Can you truly be content with that? With a marriage that's built on practical necessity rather than feeling?" Jonah stood and crossed to her, stopping close enough that Eleanor could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes. "I said it wouldn't be the same as what I had with Sarah. That was first love, young love, love built over a lifetime of knowing each other. You can't recreate that, and I wouldn't try." "But Eleanor," he reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. "That doesn't mean this would be without feeling. I've felt more in the past 3 days with you than I've felt in years. I like you. I respect you. I'm drawn to you. Those are good foundations. Maybe better than the passionate romance that burns hot and fast. This could be something that grows slowly, steadily into something strong." Eleanor looked down at their joined hands, her pale skin against his weathered tan, her soft fingers against his scarred ones. "Different in every way, and yet fitting together surprisingly well, I'm afraid," she admitted. "I'm afraid of making another mistake, of choosing wrong again, of ending up trapped in another life I can't escape." "Then don't think of it as a life sentence," Jonah said. "Think of it as a choice you're making right now, in this moment. If it doesn't work, if you're unhappy, we'll figure something else out. I'm not Charles. I won't hold you prisoner to an agreement." Eleanor met his eyes and saw he meant it. Saw the basic decency that had made him risk himself in a blizzard to save a horse, that had made him offer shelter without judgment, that had made him teach her to cook with patience instead of condescension. She'd spent 16 years in a gilded cage. Jonah was offering her a simple cabin on a mountainside and the freedom to be herself. It was terrifying and hopeful in equal measure. "There's one more thing," Eleanor said. "That land that's going to default, the 300 acres. The investment company that holds the loan, they'll likely sell it to a logging operation. They'll clear-cut the forest." Jonah's expression darkened. "I know. I've been trying not to think about it. Watching those trees fall, trees that have stood for centuries, just for profit. It makes me sick. But there's nothing I can do about it." "There might be," Eleanor said slowly, an idea forming. "If we marry, if we establish a legitimate timber business, we could try to purchase that land ourselves when it goes to auction. Not the full amount, we could never afford that. But if we can demonstrate we're serious, established, responsible, if we can show we'd manage the land sustainably, maybe we could negotiate terms." "Eleanor, we don't have the capital. I have some things. Jewelry, mostly. Pieces from my family, some from Charles. I never wore most of it. It could be sold. Combined with whatever you've saved, plus a loan against future timber sales. It's a long shot, but it's possible." Jonah stared at her. "You'd sell your jewelry? Your family heirlooms? They're just things. Pretty things I never cared about, given to me by people who never really cared about me. This," she gestured to the window, to the forest beyond. "This is real. This matters. If I'm going to start over, I want to start with something worth protecting." Jonah smiled, and it was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "You're serious?" "I am. If I'm choosing this life, then I'm choosing all of it, including fighting for that forest." She squeezed his hand. "So yes. Yes to the partnership. Yes to the marriage. Yes to building something real together. Jonah pulled her close, and Eleanor rested her head against his chest, hearing his heart beat steady and strong beneath her ear. Outside, Tom's voice called something about the road being clear. Inside, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in more years than she could count. She felt like she was finally, genuinely choosing her own life. 3 weeks later, Eleanor stood in Mrs. Harper's front parlor wearing a simple blue dress borrowed from the innkeeper's daughter. It was the first wedding day of her life that felt real. Her first marriage had been an elaborate affair in Boston, cathedral ceremony, hundreds of guests, a reception that cost more than most people earned in a year. She'd worn white silk and carried roses, and felt nothing but numb determination to get through it without embarrassing her family. She'd been 22 and terrified, and convinced she was making the only possible choice. This wedding was different in every way. The ceremony would be conducted by the circuit judge, who happened to be passing through Red Bluff. The only guests would be Mrs. Harper, Tom Brennan, and a few townspeople who'd become friendly with Eleanor during her weeks of preparation. She wore borrowed blue cotton and carried wildflowers Jonah had picked that morning, early spring blooms that had somehow survived beneath the snow, and she felt something. Fear, yes, but also hope. Genuine hope that this might actually work. "You're sure about this?" Mrs. Harper asked, adjusting Eleanor's collar with gentle efficiency. The older woman had been kind to Eleanor, offering advice and practical help without judgment. "It's not too late to change your mind. Jonah's a good man, but mountain life is hard. You're not obligated." "I'm sure," Eleanor said, and meant it. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of activity, traveling to Red Bluff, sending carefully worded letters to Boston, explaining her decision to remain west, converting her jewelry to cash, and beginning the legal process of establishing herself as a Montana resident. She'd also spent time with Jonah, working at the cabin, learning more about timber and the business they hoped to build. They'd been careful during those weeks. Tom had stayed at the cabin as chaperone, and Eleanor had lodged with Mrs. Harper in town. Everything had been proper, respectable, building toward this moment when proper and respectable would no longer require such careful management. But Eleanor had also learned more about Jonah, his quiet humor, his steady patience, his vision for sustainable forestry that went against everything she'd learned about business in Boston. She'd learned he could be stubborn when he believed he was right, that he had nightmares sometimes from the war, that he made terrible coffee but excellent stew. She'd learned he treated her as an equal in planning their business, valued her opinions, and didn't try to manage or control her decisions. She'd also learned that the attraction between them was real and growing. Not the desperate passion of novels, but something steadier, a pull like gravity, a warmth that built gradually. Their hands found each other naturally now. Their conversations flowed easily. When he smiled at her, something in her chest loosened. It wasn't what she'd had with Charles, which was good because that had been miserable. It wasn't what Jonah had described with Sarah, which was probably impossible to recreate. This was theirs, new, uncertain, but real. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Tom entered, looking uncomfortable in a clean shirt and what must have been his only tie. "Judge is ready, ma'am." "Jonah's waiting." Eleanor took a deep breath and followed him out. The ceremony was to be held in the town's small church, not because Eleanor was particularly religious, but because it seemed appropriate. A marriage might be a practical arrangement, but it still deserved some recognition of its significance. Jonah stood at the front of the church, wearing his best shirt and trousers, his hair neatly trimmed, his beard groomed. When Eleanor entered, he turned and smiled, and she saw in his eyes the same mixture of hope and fear she felt in herself. They were both taking a leap here, trusting something neither fully understood yet. The judge was a weathered man, in his 60s, who'd clearly performed many frontier weddings. He kept the ceremony brief and practical, asking them if they came freely to this marriage, if they understood its obligations, if they were prepared to honor their commitments. Eleanor answered yes to all of it, her voice steady despite her racing heart. When Jonah took her hand to place the ring, a simple gold band he'd purchased in town, His fingers trembled slightly. Eleanor found that oddly comforting. He was nervous too. This mattered to him as much as it did to her. I, Jonah Reed, take you, Eleanor Whitmore, as my wife. I promise to be honest with you, to work alongside you, to respect your choices, and value your partnership. I can't promise this will be easy, but I promise I'll try to make it good. The words weren't traditional, but they were perfect. When it was Eleanor's turn, she spoke from her heart rather than from any script. I, Eleanor Whitmore, take you, Jonah Reed, as my husband. I promise to work hard, to learn what I need to learn, to be a true partner in building this life together. I promise to be honest about my fears and my hopes. I promise to value what we're creating here, even when it's difficult. The judge pronounced them married, and Jonah leaned in to kiss her. Brief, gentle, respectful. It was their first kiss, Eleanor realized with some surprise. They'd held hands, stood close, felt the pull between them. But they'd saved this first kiss for this moment when it meant something legal and binding. When they pulled apart, Eleanor felt dizzy. From one kiss, from the recognition that she'd just bound herself to this man, this life, this uncertain future. From the realization that despite all the fear, she was happy. They signed the papers, Eleanor's hand shaking only slightly as she wrote her new name for the first time. Eleanor Reed. The celebration afterward was simple. Dinner at Mrs. Harper's Inn with their small group of supporters, followed by Jonah and Eleanor's departure for the cabin. Tom had volunteered to stay in town for a few days, giving them privacy. Eleanor appreciated the gesture, even as it made her more nervous about what came next. They rode up the mountain in Jonah's wagon as the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gold. Eleanor sat close to Jonah on the wagon seat, very aware of the ring on her finger and the man beside her who was now her husband. Nervous? Jonah asked quietly. Yes, Eleanor admitted.
Are you?
Terrified. The honest answer made Eleanor laugh, releasing some of her tension. That's oddly comforting. We'll figure it out, Jonah said. No pressure, no expectations except what we create together. This is our marriage, Eleanor. We get to decide what it looks like. When they reached the cabin, Jonah helped her down from the wagon with careful courtesy. Someone, probably Tom, had been up here earlier because smoke rose from the chimney and lamplight glowed through the windows. Inside, the cabin was warm and welcoming, the fire burning steadily, fresh wood stacked nearby. Eleanor removed her cloak, suddenly uncertain what to do with herself. This was her home now. This simple cabin on a mountainside was where she lived. The bed in the corner was no longer just Jonah's bed. It was their bed. The thought made her face warm. I made some changes, Jonah said, gesturing around the cabin. Eleanor looked more carefully and saw what she'd missed initially. The bed had been moved to give it more privacy from the rest of the room. A small vanity table had been added, rough but functional, with a mirror and space for her few belongings. Curtains hung at the windows, simple but cheerful. I know it's not what you're used to. It's perfect, Eleanor interrupted. Jonah, it's perfect. You didn't have to do all this. I wanted you to feel like this was your home, not just my cabin you were staying in. I want you to be comfortable here. Eleanor crossed to him and took his hands. I am comfortable, more comfortable than I ever was in my Beacon Hill mansion. Do you know why? Why? Because this is honest. Everything here is real. The work is real. The fire is real. The food we eat is real because we prepared it ourselves. Even this marriage, despite being built on practical necessity, is more honest than 16 years with Charles. He never cared what I thought or felt. You ask my opinion about everything from timber sales to what to have for supper. That matters more than fancy furniture. Jonah squeezed her hands gently. I'm glad you see it that way. But Eleanor, about tonight, I know, Eleanor said quickly. You said no expectations. This is a partnership first. We'll figure out the rest as we go. I did say that. But I also need to be honest about something. Jonah paused, seeming to gather his courage. I care about you, more than I expected to when I first made this offer. These past weeks, working with you, talking with you, planning our future, it's made me realize I want this to be a real marriage, not just a business arrangement or a marriage of convenience. But I also don't want to rush you or make you uncomfortable. Eleanor felt her heart beating faster. What are you saying? I'm saying I want to build something real with you. Not just a business, but a partnership in every sense. A marriage that grows into something strong and good. But that takes time, and I'm willing to take that time if you need it. Eleanor thought about what he was offering: patience, respect, the space to let their relationship develop naturally. It was so different from Charles, who'd claimed his marital rights on their wedding night with business-like efficiency and never showed interest in her comfort or feelings. I care about you too, Eleanor said softly. More than I thought possible after such a short time. I'm not afraid of you, Jonah. I'm only afraid of my own inexperience. My first marriage wasn't something I enjoyed. It was an obligation I fulfilled. Understanding dawned in Jonah's eyes. Then we take our time. No pressure. We share the bed because it's more practical than one of us sleeping on the floor. But nothing has to happen until you're ready. Until we're both ready. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at his gentleness. Thank you. They prepared for bed with careful courtesy, each giving the other privacy to change. When Eleanor finally climbed under the quilts, wearing her nightdress, Jonah joined her in his nightshirt, leaving careful space between them. But after a moment, Eleanor reached across that space and found his hand. Their fingers intertwined in the darkness. "Good night, husband," Eleanor whispered. "Good night, wife," Jonah replied. They fell asleep that way, hands joined, space between them, but connected. It was a beginning, not the dramatic, passionate beginning of romantic novels, but something better, something real, something honest, something that had room to grow into whatever they needed it to be. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in the clear mountain sky. Inside, two people who'd both lost their way began the slow work of building something new together. Spring came to the mountains slowly, grudgingly, as if winter was reluctant to release its hold. But by late April, the snow had retreated to the highest peaks, wildflowers dotted the meadows, and the forest rang with bird song. Eleanor stood in the clearing where Jonah had mounted their new sign, simple wood, carved with careful letters. Reed and Whitmore Timber, stewards of the land. She touched the wood, still amazed that her name was there, that she was part of something real and growing. The past 2 months had been challenging in ways Eleanor never anticipated. Her muscles ached constantly from physical labor. Her hands developed calluses. She learned that timber work was dangerous, exhausting, and required skills she'd never imagined needing. She'd made mistakes, some small, some significant. There'd been moments of frustration, of missing hot baths and soft beds, of wondering if she'd made a terrible error. But there'd also been triumphs. She'd successfully negotiated their first timber contract with a mill in Red Bluff, using business skills that translated better than she'd expected. She'd learned to identify different tree species, to understand sustainable harvesting practices, to manage accounts and inventory. She and Jonah worked well together. His physical knowledge, combined with her organizational skills, created something stronger than either could manage alone. And their marriage, their real marriage, had grown slowly, carefully, into something Eleanor treasured. They'd learned each other's rhythms, learned when to give space and when to offer support. The physical side of their relationship had developed naturally, without pressure, growing from those first nights of simply holding hands in the darkness into genuine intimacy built on trust and growing affection. Eleanor wasn't foolish enough to call it the grand passion of romantic stories. But it was deeper than passion. It was partnership, genuine friendship, and a warmth that steadied rather than burned. She and Jonah fit together in ways she'd never experienced, complementing each other's strengths and supporting each other's weaknesses. The sound of an approaching wagon pulled Eleanor from her thoughts. Jonah appeared from the forest, leading their horse and a small load of timber they'd harvested that morning. He saw her standing by the sign and smiled. That slow, warm smile that still made something in Eleanor's chest tighten. "Admiring our handiwork?" he called. "Always," Eleanor replied, moving to help him unload. They worked together efficiently, the result of weeks of practice, stacking the timber properly for seasoning. When the work was finished, Jonah pulled an envelope from his pocket. Tom brought mail this morning while you were checking the north boundary. Letter from Boston. Eleanor's stomach tightened, but she took the envelope. The return address was her lawyer's office. She opened it carefully, aware of Jonah watching with concern. The letter was brief. The Beacon Hill house had sold, the proceeds used to satisfy creditors. Eleanor's personal jewelry, sold through reputable dealers, had brought more than expected. After all debts were settled, there was a small amount remaining, enough to cover the mortgage on the 300 acres when the property went to auction in June. "We can bid," Eleanor breathed, looking up at Jonah. "With this plus what we've saved from the timber sales, we have enough to make a serious offer." Jonah read over her shoulder, his expression cautious. "It's not guaranteed. Other buyers might bid higher, they might. But we have an advantage. We're local, we're committed to sustainable practices, and we already own the adjacent property. If the judge who handles the auction values stewardship over pure profit, we have a chance. You really want to do this? Use everything we have to save those trees." Eleanor looked toward the forest, the towering pines that had stood for centuries, that deserved to stand for centuries more. "I do. This matters more than having security funds. Besides," she smiled at Jonah, "I've learned that security isn't about money in a bank. It's about knowing you can work hard, that you have skills and a partner, that you're building something meaningful." Jonah pulled her close, kissing her forehead. "When did you get so wise?" "When I started paying attention to what actually matters instead of what I was told should matter." They stood together in the clearing, the cabin behind them, the forest around them, the sign bearing both their names overhead. Eleanor thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, the wealthy widow who'd mocked this simple cabin, who'd measured worth in dollars and status, who'd been so lost without knowing it. That woman seemed like a stranger now. "Do you ever regret it?" Jonah asked quietly. "Giving up your old life?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. "I regret the years I wasted. I regret not having the courage to leave sooner. But giving it up? No, I didn't give up anything real. I traded illusion for truth, emptiness for purpose, comfort for meaning. That's not a sacrifice, it's a gift." "You gave me a gift too," Jonah said. "I was half alive up here, going through motions, preserving Sarah's memory, but not actually living. You reminded me that it's possible to start over, to build something new while still honoring what came before." Eleanor understood. She'd seen Jonah change too, seen him open up, laugh more easily, make plans for the future instead of just maintaining the present. They'd both been stuck in different ways. They'd helped each other become unstuck. That evening, they sat on the cabin's small porch, another addition Jonah had built, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and purple. Eleanor leaned against her husband's shoulder, her hand resting on his knee, completely comfortable in the silence between them. She thought about the carved wooden bird Jonah had given her that first week, still displayed on the shelf inside. "For the woman who learned to fly," he'd said. At the time, she hadn't fully understood. Now she did. Flying wasn't about wealth or status or security. It was about having the courage to let go of what was safe but empty, to risk everything for the possibility of something real. Eleanor had learned to fly, and she'd discovered that the landing, here, in this simple cabin with this good man beside her, was exactly where she was meant to be. The mountains stood eternal around them. The forest whispered its ancient songs. And two people who'd both lost their way sat together in the fading light, content in the knowledge that sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what you've been searching for all along.